So even though I started a car sharing company, my story actually begins on a bike. I was living in Boston. This is Boston. There's lots of schools in Boston. And it was a really awful winter day. So I was using Zipcar. I was a big fan of Zipcar at the time. For those that you don't know it, it's the biggest car sharing company in the US, sort of similar to Car2Go or BMW Drive down here. And I had actually planned to buy a car. And while I was waiting to buy a car, I signed up for the Zipcar thing. And I was able to access mobility instead of needing to buy a car. And over the course of that year, I found I didn't really need a car. Whenever I needed one, I could just rent a Prius for the day if I was going to the store, a convertible if I was going to the beach, an SUV if I was going to the mountains. And I found that I was driving less. I didn't have a car sitting outside, so I was walking more and biking more and taking public transit. I was saving money and headaches. This felt like a great change for me. But what I found is that if I waited until I needed a car, all the cars close to me were booked. And so this brings me back to my bike. So I reserved the closest car to me on this really awful winter day in Boston, and I had to bike 2.5 miles to get to the closest car. It was one of these days where it was like sleeting upwards in every direction the elements are attacking you. And I'm on my bike sort of grumbling as I'm getting to the car, and noticing all these cars that were lining the streets that were covered in snow and hadn't been driven in weeks. Sort of grumbling and saying, like, why am I having to trudge through the sleet and the snow to get to these cars? Why can't I just get in that car? Wait a minute. Stop for a second. Why can't I just get in that car? As Americans, we have a love affair with the automobile. You guys have it a little bit better here in Europe, but we actually have more cars than drivers. We have 20% more cars than drivers in the United States. It is crazy. We don't need more cars to make mobility more accessible. So what if we could take the benefits of Zipcar and we could combine it with a peer-to-peer marketplace like eBay? We could better utilize the cars that are already on our own streets. This made a ton of sense to me. Just instantly it was clear. I thought, why isn't this around? There must be a reason. So I went home and tried to figure it out. I came up with two main reasons. The first one was pretty practical. Like, how do you insure this thing? Insurance companies, by definition, are risk adverse. And we had to find an entirely new way to insure something. But another thing was, who else would do this? Of the existing companies that are out there, the big mobility providers, the transportation companies, who would do this? So let's think of the big players, Zipcar, who brought me to this idea. Would they do this? So Zipcar has a big fleet of cars. They need to maximize utilization on these vehicles. If they had this influx of all these personal cars, that it would prevent them from optimizing their own fleet. They couldn't do this. Avis or Hertz, what about them? They'd have similar issues to Zipcar. What about the car companies like GM or Ford or BMW? They're trying to sell cars. I didn't buy a car because I could access mobility. They wouldn't want to do this. So with that, TURO was born. And I started the world's first peer-to-peer car sharing marketplace. So this is what it looks like. This is actually my car. It's a little yellow mini convertible. You can rent it for 45 bucks a day. I've made thousands of dollars renting my car to hundreds of people. So anybody can create a profile for their car. And then when people want to rent it, they request the vehicle. The car owner can take a look at that request, take a look at the person's reputation, the schedule, and approve or decline it. But in the early days, I was worried about failure. And one of the biggest things I was worried about was those big companies. I thought back to the stories of Napster. Napster, for those of you who don't know, was a file-sharing service in the late 90s. And people started sharing music. And the record companies were completely against this, and eventually they shut it down. And I was worried, will the car companies do the same thing for us? Will we just get swatted out of existence? So I was worried that we needed to fly under the radar. When we thought about launching, I actually picked a market, Baltimore, to launch it. Baltimore is not the best market to launch many things, particularly something that requires a lot of trust in your neighbors. Baltimore is very high crime. It doesn't have the right demographics. But I picked it because it was a city where Zipcar wasn't, because I was too afraid of the big companies. Eventually, I actually got introduced to the CEO of Zipcar. And it was a completely different conversation than I expected. Instead of him trying to crush me, he invited me to his office. We sat down and we met for 2 hours. And at the end, we were talking about partnerships. That made me confident to start speaking with other people. We ended up doing a deal with a major insurance company. They invested in my company. So I started knocking on the door of car manufacturers, and we ended up doing a major deal with General Motors. As a tiny company with less than 20 employees, we did a huge deal. We did a technology integration with GM's safety and security system OnStar. So anybody who had a GM car could sign up and link their OnStar and their RelayRides accounts and make their car instantly RelayRides accessible. Any renter who rented that car could walk up and unlock it with their smartphone. It was an amazing integration and opened a ton of doors for us. But a lot of people asked, why would GM do this? Why would GM make it easier for people to not own a car? And they had a great response. We could stand on the sidelines and watch, or we could choose to participate and try to make it into a favorable business model. So they could either try and stop it, they could either, like the record labels did, they could stand on the sidelines, or they could see this as an opportunity. GM has continued that direction. Last year, their CEO said, "We are disrupting ourselves. We're not trying to preserve a model of yesterday." And they're not alone. Ford has recently rebranded from a car company to a mobility company. And so is BMW. BMW is selling mobility now instead of just selling cars. And even as a company that's disrupted, that has been a disruptor in the mobility space, we constantly have to be looking forward. Where are the trends going? How do we stay ahead of this? So shared mobility, I think, is something that's really important. Car sharing, bike sharing, ride sharing, all of these things where people are accessing mobility as opposed to driving their own personal car, I think they continue to grow. And they will continue to self-reinforce themselves. So the more options that you have to not just drive yourself, the easier it is to live without a personal car. Another thing is multimodal transit. So as you have all these different options, you've got car sharing, you've got bike sharing, ride sharing, public transit, they all combine to form a better system. So imagine a trip that starts off with bike sharing, takes you to a train, and ends with car sharing, creating a personal mobility portfolio. I think that as you have more of these opportunities, they're going to, all of the markets are going to continue to grow bigger and bigger.
So Shelby, you spoke about how you were afraid of failure. I'm just thinking, how many times have you failed with startups?
Well, I think that I got pretty lucky with my first one. TURO was my first company that I started, and it's done quite well, continues to do well. Since then, I started another company. It was called Peers, and that was sort of a similar sharing economy idea. We looked at the rise in the number of entrepreneurs who are making a living through these marketplaces. And we tried to create a benefits platform that would sort of create the back end for all these people. In the end, I think that we were a little bit ahead of our time, and it didn't really end up working. I think it's still a really big idea, and I think that there still is an opportunity there, but timing is everything. But I think that you can't be afraid of failure. I'm still very happy that I took the leap and had a lot of fun doing it, and I think it was a very inspiring journey. So that's one thing that's really nice about where I live in California is failure it's not taboo. It's sort of a part of doing business, and you have to be ready to take the leap and just move forward.
Move forward. And speaking about moving forward, you just mentioned what's next for TURO. I'm just wondering what happens when the disruptor is being disrupted. How do you prevent the disruption heading in TURO's way? For example, autonomous cars.
Yeah, well, I don't think you do prevent the disruption, but you have to watch out for it. You have to be aware, and you have to constantly be adapting. If you try to stop disruption, I think you're going to be left in the dust. And it's more keeping your eyes open, finding out what are the interesting things that are happening, and figuring out how you can take advantage of them.
So we've seen the rise of the sharing economy, but what kind of limitations do you see when we talk about the sharing economy in the future? Are there any?
Well, I think that a lot of the principles for these sharing economy companies are universal. Some of the core tenets in the sharing economy are that access trumps ownership, that I care more about getting from point A to point B than I do about owning the car, and the concept that value unused is waste. I also think that these marketplaces bring people together in these massively scalable ways, creating these networks. So I think that a lot of the principles behind the sharing economy are universal and can be applied to lots of different ways. I think we will continue to see them. One area where there's been a lot of struggle is with regulation and laws. many of these companies don't fit into the laws that that were made maybe 50 or 100 years ago. Uber and Airbnb have definitely been running into this. There's been a lot of issues around worker rights and benefits, and that was one of the reasons why I started the company Peers. But I think that these companies need to view the opportunity, but be really careful about where they're bumping into some of the laws and regulations.